You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt show Professor Jerry Muller, who's a professor of history at the Catholic University of America, and his most recent book is called Capitalism and the Jews. Jerry, it's a real pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Doug.
So I'm sure I'm not the first person to tell you, but the title of your book, Capitalism and the Jews, could obviously be interpreted with a little bit of a negative point of view. How'd you come up with the title?
I know that some people have viewed the title as provocative. It actually wasn't intended that way. It was simply that having written this series of interconnected essays on the various sorts of links between capitalism and the Jews, it seemed to me that the common denominator of the essays and the real topic of the book was indeed capitalism and the Jews. And therefore, it made a lot of sense to call it that.
Okay. So a lot of times there's a connection that people make between anti-Semitism and capitalism, which I obviously want to touch on. But before we even go there, maybe you could just start by giving us a more clear definition of capitalism and what's the relevance to Jewish thought?
Well, capitalism is like all concepts in the social sciences. It's a kind of ideal type. It's a kind of model that exists to one degree or another in the real historical world. So one way of thinking about it is it's a society which is primarily commercial. That is, a society in which people sell most of what they produce, including their labor, and they buy most of the things that they need. And it's a society in which there is private property, in which goods and services are exchanged by free individuals, and in which prices and production are set by supply and demand in the market rather than by tradition or by government edict. So that's a pretty good set of characteristics for thinking about what capitalism is.
And by means of example, would you say it's fair to say that the United States is the predominant example today of capitalism in the world, or is there another country to look at?
Well, there are many varieties of capitalism in the world that have various degrees of economic freedom, of relationship between the market and the state, and so on. The United States is often considered the paradigmatic example, but there are hundreds of varieties of capitalism around the world, including most of, indeed all of, contemporary Europe. In many respects, China is increasingly a capitalist society, and of course, the place that you're calling from, Israel, has become in time very much a capitalist society as well.
So it is funny that you say that because Israel certainly has a very strong socialist history, as the country started very much that way. So what is the connection between capitalism and Jewish thought?
Well, my book actually isn't primarily about capitalism and Jewish thought, though some of it does deal with how Jews thought about capitalism, both pro and con. More important than capitalism and Jewish thought, I mean, there's always been a role in Jewish thought, at least from the time of the Roman period, that is to say, from the time of the Mishnah. There's always been a role for commerce, and there's lots of discussion of commerce and torts and so on in the Mishnah and Gemara. But to say that there's a discussion of commerce is not to say that the Jewish thought was capitalistic in the sense of recommending or being based upon free markets and free exchange. So there's a good deal of that in traditional Jewish thought in the sense of the Mishnah, Gemara, and the subsequent development of halakha. But what's been more important for the Jews than the religious content of their thought has been the historical position in which they found themselves at least from the beginning of the medieval period in Europe, so roughly from 8 to 900, say, really to the dawn of the modern era and then beyond. And that position was one of a politically powerless minority that often, in most times and places in medieval Europe, was very much centered on certain economic roles, above all commercial roles of various sorts, and the whole role of money lending, which was important in terms of the functions that Jews played in medieval European society. And as a result, Jews entered the modern period, say starting with the 18th century roughly, with far more commercial involvement and commercial experience and commercial know-how than most of their Gentile counterparts in Europe. That was true throughout Europe. It was especially important as you moved eastward in Europe, that is towards Eastern Europe and towards Russia, societies that were less advanced and less commercial than was the case in Western Europe in places like England and France. And so especially as you moved into Central and above all Eastern Europe, Jews often were the commercial class. And so as these societies became more capitalist in the modern period, in the course of the 18th and 19th and even 20th centuries, Jews with their prior experience of commerce often excelled in the economic development of those countries.
Okay. We are talking with Professor Jerry Muller, who's a professor of history at the Catholic University of America. His most recent book is Capitalism and the Jews, which we're talking about now. He's written other books in the past, which are certainly worth looking at, including Adam Smith in His Time and Ours. Jerry, you're talking about the Jews being moneylenders historically. And tell me, is it a rumor that the Jews became that really because of rules of the church that prohibited church members from lending to each other, meaning that the Jews were the only ones who could do it, or is that kind of a repainting of history?
That's more than half truth. That is to say, as European society started to become more commercial from about 1100 on, credit, that is to say the lending of money, became more important and necessary. And the lending of money at interest was prohibited by the church. And as a result, in order to create a situation where Christians weren't involved in that sinful activity, the activity was often relegated to those who were regarded by the church as beyond salvation, that is to say, to the Jews. So there was a certain push factor there, and then from the Jewish point of view, there was a certain pull factor in a couple of ways. First of all, Jews had a certain relative advantage in that they tended to have much higher levels of male literacy than the surrounding population, and that was conducive to commerce. And also, in terms of rabbinic thought at the time, they often encouraged Jews to go into commerce and money lending rather than agriculture, because they argued that commercial life and financial life, while it was demanding, still left you more time than agriculture did for limud Torah, for Torah study. Mm-hmm. So there were both push and pull factors that drew the Jews into commerce in general and into money lending in particular.
So let's talk about the darker side of it, which is that a lot of people blame or point to the Jews as the ones controlling all the money, and they got to that position because of capitalism, and that it's led to a great deal of anti-Semitism and perhaps extreme anti-Semitism, with the pinnacle being the Holocaust. Is there truth to this?
As with many stereotypes, there's a grain of truth to it that then gets wildly exaggerated. in Eastern Europe, not so much in Western Europe or the United States, but in Eastern Europe and to a lesser degree in Central Europe, Jews in the 19th and 20th centuries were often disproportionately involved with commercial activity in general and financial activity in particular. Rarely was it the case that they actually controlled commerce or finance, but they were disproportionately represented. And it's the nature of capitalism that, as Joseph Schumpeter put it, it's a process of creative destruction. That is to say, there are new institutions being created all the time, new forms of marketing, new products, new ways of producing things, and all that innovation has its shadow side, its downside. When you create a new way of producing things or of marketing things, it means that the people who produce things the old way or marketed them the old way find their standard of living or even their very means of living in decline. And capitalism also has a certain amount of instability built into it. And often enough, when that instability took hold or when people experienced economic crisis or even just downward social mobility, they were looking for someone to blame for it, and you had this phenomenon, Jews being disproportionately represented and disproportionately salient. So there often was a connection between anti-capitalism and anti-Semitism.
But even today you see it as well. People who are maybe at the core anti-Semitic, they'll point to the fact that Ben Bernanke and his predecessor Alan Greenspan also went to shul on Shabbat. Didn't necessarily go to shul, but okay, let's say we're Jewish.
Exactly.
Members of the tribe.
Right. I mean, Alan Greenspan was more likely to worship at the shrine of Ayn Rand than to go to shul, but I take your point. I think that on the whole, there's much less of that now than there was in the past. That is a tendency to blame capitalist crises on the Jews, but you still do find the phenomenon. And of course, it is striking that Jews are overrepresented in American finance, though they're by no means dominant. And Jews have been overrepresented among economists and among distinguished economists, including the ones who have headed the Federal Reserve in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And those who've been on the Goldstein on Gelt show as well.
Right.
So, but you wouldn't argue that this is some nefarious connection, but rather that's the way it goes. Jews have been involved in money for hundreds of years. They worked their way up and seem to have a knack for it. Yes.
When we say that they seem to have a knack for it, I think putting it in more social scientific terms, they had a few things that made them, a few characteristics that tended to make them excel at market activity. One was the fact that I alluded to already, that they simply had more experience of it, and that is often passed down to one degree or another within families or within communities. The whole notion of buying low and selling high, the whole notion of being on the lookout for economic opportunity, for places where there are markets that are underserved or where there's some kind of demand that isn't being met. And of course, the fact that Jews were often excluded in the past, either by law or by social prejudice from many areas of established economic life, tended to make them more on the lookout for new economic opportunities. Mm-hmm. And that helps explain why in so many times and places in modern European and American or in history of the New World, Jews were often disproportionately involved in capitalist activity.
Okay, and there certainly is a great deal more to learn about that in your book, Capitalism and the Jews. We've been talking with Professor Jerry Muller, who wrote the book Capitalism and the Jews, is a professor of history, and perhaps you've seen his writing as well, from the Wall Street Journal to the New Republic. In many, many other places. Jerry, I'm sorry to say, but we're just about out of time. But in the last few seconds, can you tell people how could they follow your work?
Well, they could type Jerry Z. Muller into Google, and you'll get some of it there. They could take a look at my book, Capitalism and the Jews. They could look at my most recent article in Foreign Affairs on capitalism and inequality. Those are probably the best ways of starting to go about it.
Okay. Jerry Muller, thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure, Doug.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt show.